Commander Jiho pressed his palms against the cold metal of the bridge railing, staring at the massive view screen that dominated the front wall of the research vessel horizon. The image before him made no sense. His mind kept trying to reject what his eyes were telling him. The sensors did not lie. Earth was dead. The planet that had been humanity's cradle for millions of years now hung in space like a burned coal, its surface cracked and glowing with the dull red of cooling magma. No blue oceans reflected the light of Sol. No white clouds drifted across green continents. The world that had given birth to 8 billion human souls was nothing more than a sphere of ash and molten rock. Jiho had been away for 3 years, leading a research mission to study dark matter anomalies in the outer reaches of the galaxy. 3 years of careful measurements, of mapping quantum fields, of pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. He had dreamed of returning home to share their discoveries, to see his family again, to walk once more through the gardens of New Sol. Instead, he had come home to find a graveyard. Navigator Minho sat hunched over his console, his young face pale with shock. The man had joined the crew straight from the academy, full of excitement about exploring the unknown. Now his hands shook as he worked the controls, running scan after scan, as if hoping the readings would change. Sir Minho called out, his voice cracking. The sensors are picking up something strange on the surface. There are structures down there that were not built by humans. Jiho forced himself to step closer to the view screen. As the image zoomed in, he could see them clearly. Now, massive crystalline towers jutted up from the planet's scarred surface like jagged teeth. They were perfectly geometric, their surfaces covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow when he looked at them directly. A pale blue light pulsed within each structure, creating an eerie glow that made his eyes water. Science Officer Yuna approached from her station, holding a tablet computer in her steady hands. She had always been calm under pressure, but Jiho could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her jaw was clenched tight. "The translation matrix has been working on the inscriptions," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "The patterns on those towers are not random. They're writing in a language our computers have never encountered before." Jiho took the tablet from her hands and read the translated text. The words were simple, but they hit him like a physical blow. Payment for trespass. The message was repeated over and over across the surface of each tower, written in script that looked like frozen lightning. "The computer has identified the language," Yuna continued. "It belongs to a species called the Kethmori. We have no records of any previous contact with them, but the linguistic analysis suggests they are very old. Much older than human civilization?" Jiho stared at the tablet, his mind racing. Payment for trespass. The meaning was clear enough. Humanity had spread across the galaxy over the past few centuries, establishing colonies on hundreds of worlds, building space stations, mining asteroids. They had assumed they were alone among the stars, or at least alone among intelligent life. They had been wrong. The bridge crew worked in silence around him, their faces grim as they processed the reality of what they were seeing. Chief Engineer Deho ran diagnostics on the ship's systems, his scarred hands moving across the controls with practiced efficiency. Communications Officer Yuna sat at her station, sending out signals to other human vessels and colonies, trying to get a picture of what had happened while they were away. Slowly, the reports began to come in. The outer colonies were intact, but many had gone silent. The inner worlds closest to Earth had suffered attacks, their populations fleeing in whatever ships they could find. Kethmori had struck without warning, their weapons turning entire countenance into glass before moving on to the next target. But Earth had received the worst treatment. The planet had not just been attacked. It had been made into an example. Jiho closed his eyes and tried to push away the images that filled his mind. His sister had lived in the floating cities above the Pacific. His parents had retired to a quiet farm in what used to be called Korea. His childhood friends, his teachers, the woman he had planned to marry when he returned from the mission. All of them were gone, reduced to ash and scattered across the solar winds. When he opened his eyes, again, something had changed in his expression. The grief was still there, but it had been joined by something else, something cold and hard and completely focused. Yuna, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the bridge. Send a message to all surviving human colonies and ships. Tell them Earth has been destroyed. Tell them we know who did it. Tell them we are going to find these Kethmori and make them pay for what they have done. The communications officer nodded and began typing the message. Around the bridge, the crew straightened in their chairs. They had lost their home, but they still had their ship and their lives. More importantly, they had their purpose. The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of the engines and the distant crackling of radiation from their dead homeworld. Out. In that silence, something new was born. Not just grief or anger, but determination. The Kethmori had wanted to teach humanity a lesson about trespassing in their territory. They were about to learn that some lessons came with a price of their own. Admiral Riho stood in the command center of his flagship, watching the holographic display that showed the positions of his fleet. 37 ships floated in the darkness of space, each one carrying the last hope of humanity. 6 months had passed since they found Earth reduced to ash, and in that time, they had become hunters. The fleet was not impressive to look at. Most of the ships were cargo vessels that had been quickly fitted with weapons. Others were old military ships that should have been retired years ago. A few were civilian passenger liners whose owners had volunteered to join the fight. But they were all that remained of humanity's presence in the galaxy, and Jiho was determined to make them count. They had been chasing the Kethmori across 17 different star systems, always arriving too late to save the worlds under attack. Each planet they found told the same story. Cities turned to glass, oceans boiled away, life wiped clean from the surface. And always, those strange crystalline towers left behind like grave markers, their blue light pulsing in the darkness. Lieutenant Subin worked at the tactical station, her fingers dancing across the controls as she analyzed the sensor readings. She was young, barely out of the academy, but she had learned quickly during their months of pursuit. The loss of her home colony had given her a focus that impressed even the veteran officers. "Admiral," she called out, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the bridge. Long-range sensors are picking up 3 contacts moving toward the Tau Ceti system. The energy signatures match the Kethmori ships we have been tracking. Felt his heart rate increase. Tau Ceti was home to one of the largest human colonies outside of the Sol system. Nearly 2 million people lived on the planets and space stations there, including many refugees from the earlier attacks. If the Kethmori reached them, it would be another massacre. "How long until they reach the colony?" he asked. 18 hours at their current speed, Subban replied. Jiho nodded grimly. They had been waiting for this moment, a chance to intercept the enemy before they could destroy another human world. Send the signal to all ships. We are going to battle formation. The fleet began to move, the ships spreading out in a formation that would give them the best chance against the superior alien technology. Jiho watched the tactical display as his captains maneuvered their vessels into position. Each ship represented hundreds of human lives, and he was about to risk them all in a desperate gamble. The journey to Tau Ceti took 14 hours. When they arrived, the Kethmori ships were already there, moving toward the inner planets like predators stalking their prey. Jiho got his first clear look at the enemy vessels through the main view screen. The sight made his blood run cold. The Kethmori ships were unlike anything humans had ever built. They looked like massive crystalline spears, their surfaces covered in the same geometric patterns that decorated the monuments they left behind. Heat distortions rippled around each vessel, making them appear to shimmer and dance in the darkness of space. They were beautiful in a terrible way, like weapons crafted by gods. "All ships engage the enemy," Jiho ordered. The battle began immediately. The human fleet opened fire with everything they had, but their weapons seemed to have little effect. On the alien ships, the Kethmori vessels responded with beams of pure heat that could melt through the strongest armor in seconds. Within minutes, 3 human ships had been destroyed. Their crews vaporized in bursts of superheated plasma. Jiho watched in horror as his fleet was being torn apart. They were outgunned, outmatched, and facing technology they could barely understand. But just as he was beginning to think the battle was lost, Chief Engineer Daeho came through with a desperate plan. "Admiral, if we can get close enough to one of their ships, we can hit it with an electromagnetic pulse," Daeho reported over the communication system. "It might disrupt their power systems long enough for us to disable them." It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. Jiho ordered the flagship to make a suicide run at the nearest Kethmori vessel, using the other ships as cover. The alien ship's heat weapons tore through the human fleet, but Daeho managed to get within range and triggered the electromagnetic pulse. The effect was immediate. The Kethmori ship went dark, its crystalline surface losing its glow as the power systems failed. It drifted helplessly in space, unable to maneuver or fire its weapons. "Boarding parties, prepare for assault," Jiho commanded. Sergeant Heian led the attack, taking a team of Marines aboard the disabled alien vessel. What they found inside changed everything. The Kethmori ship was filled with technology that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Devices that could manipulate matter at the smallest level, making atoms move faster or slower at will. Weapons that could heat entire planets to the point where rock melted like water. But the most important discovery came from the ship's databanks. Intelligence officer Nari worked for hours to decode the alien information, her face growing paler as she learned the truth about humanity's enemy. "They are ancient," she reported to Jiho, "older than our entire civilization. They have been traveling through the galaxy for millions of years, destroying any species that dares to leave their home planet. We are not their first victims. Have wiped out 43 different civilizations before us." Jiho felt a chill run down his spine. "How many more do they plan to destroy?" "All of them," Nari replied. "They call it the final cleansing. They believe that space belongs only to them, and any species that tries to colonize other worlds must be eliminated completely. They plan to finish hunting down every human colony within the next year." The Admiral stared at the data, understanding finally the scope of what they were facing. This was not just a war for humanity's survival. It was a fight against an ancient evil that had been committing genocide across the galaxy for eons. But now, for the first time, they had captured Kethmori technology. And with it, perhaps they could find a way to fight back. Dr. Wanho rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the clock on the laboratory wall. It was 3 in the morning. The research facility on Kepler 442b was quiet, except for the hum of machines and the distant sound of air recyclers. Most of the base personnel were asleep, but Wanho had been working for 18 hours straight. Trying to understand the alien technology they had captured from the Kethmori ship, the laboratory was filled with strange devices that seemed to defy everything humans knew about physics. Crystalline structures that could manipulate energy at the quantum level, machines that could make atoms dance to their will, weapons that could heat matter until planets melted like ice cream in the sun. Dr. Hannah sat at the workstation next to him, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail as she studied the test results on her computer screen. She had been working alongside Wanho for months, trying to reverse engineer the alien technology. Both scientists had lost family when Earth was destroyed, and their grief had transformed into a burning determination to understand their enemy's weapons. "The Kethmori technology is based on molecular manipulation," Wanho said, speaking his thoughts out loud as he often did when he was tired. "They can speed up the movement of atoms, making them vibrate faster and faster until they generate incredible heat. That is how they turn entire planets into furnaces." Hannah nodded, not looking up from her screen. "But if they can make molecules move faster," she said slowly, "then the opposite should also be possible. If we can understand the process, we should be able to make molecules slow down instead of speed up." Wanho stopped what he was doing and turned to look at his assistant. The idea was so simple that he wondered why he had not thought of it before. "You are right," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. "If we can reverse their process, we could create weapons that freeze instead of burn." They worked through the night, modifying one of the captured Kethmori devices. The alien technology was incredibly complex, but the basic principle was surprisingly straightforward. The devices use quantum fields to influence the behavior of atoms, either speeding them up or slowing them down, depending on the settings. By dawn, they had built their first prototype. It was crude and ugly, a device the size of a shipping container that looked like it had been put together from spare parts. But when they activated it in the testing chamber, the results were beyond anything they had hoped for. The machine created a field that slowed molecular motion to almost nothing. Within seconds, a cubic meter of space had been frozen to near absolute zero. The air inside the test chamber turned solid, falling to the floor like snow. The walls began to crack as the metal contracted from the extreme cold. "Look at this," Hannah said, pointing to the readings on her computer. "We are not just slowing down molecular motion in the target area. The effect is spreading outward through the quantum fields, creating a cascade reaction." Wanho stared at the data in amazement. The freezing effect was not contained to the area directly targeted by their device. Instead, it was spreading slowly through space itself, following the invisible quantum connections that linked all matter together. It was like dropping a stone into a pond and watching the ripples spread outward. "This is incredible," he whispered. "If we can scale this up, we could freeze entire regions of space, could turn their own quantum manipulation technology against them." Word of their discovery reached Admiral Jiho within hours. The Admiral arrived at the research facility on the fastest ship available, bringing with him a team of military engineers and scientists. When Wanho and Hannah showed him the test results, his expression remained serious. But something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Show me exactly how it works," Jiho said. Wanho activated the prototype again, demonstrating how the device could create expanding fields of absolute cold. "Kethmori used quantum manipulation to heat matter by making molecules move faster," he explained. "We have reversed the process. Instead of speeding up molecular motion, we slow it down until it almost stops completely." The Admiral studied the frozen test chamber where ice crystals covered every surface, and the air itself had turned solid. "What would happen if we built a larger version of this device, something that could affect an entire planet or star system?" Hannah pulled up her calculations on the computer screen. "Theoretically, there is no limit to how large we could make the effect. The cascade reaction means that once we start the freezing process, it spreads on its own through the quantum fields. We could potentially freeze entire solar systems if we had enough power." Jiho was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. How long would it take to build a weapon-sized version of this technology? 6 months? Maybe less if we get all the resources we need, Wanho replied. "We would need to build the device on a much larger scale, probably the size of a space station. And we would need materials that can handle the extreme energy requirements." The Admiral nodded slowly. "You will have whatever you need. Ships, personnel, materials, anything. The Kethmori have spent months turning our worlds to ash. It is time we showed them what absolute zero feels like." As Jiho left the laboratory to begin organizing the construction project, Wanho and Hannah looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and fear. They had created something that could potentially save humanity from extinction. But they had also created something that could freeze entire galaxies solid. The question now was whether they could build their weapon before the Kethmori finished their plan to wipe out every human in the galaxy. The race against time had begun, and the fate of both species hung in the balance. The asteroid belt around the dead star system of Kepler 186 had become the busiest place in human space. Thousands of workers floated in protective suits among the floating rocks, welding metal plates and installing quantum generators on structures that grew larger each day. The thermal nullification platforms were taking shape, each one the size of a small moon and packed with technology that could freeze entire worlds. Engineer Taeyong guided his construction pod between the massive metal framework, checking the installation of the quantum cascade generators. These devices were the heart of the weapon, designed to spread the freezing effect across possible distances through the invisible connections that linked all matter in the universe. Each generator, it was as large as a building, its crystalline core pulsing with contained energy that made the air around it shimmer. "Section 12 is complete," reported his assistant through the radio. The quantum field amplifiers are online and ready for testing. Taeyang nodded, but his expression remained troubled. He guided his pod to the observation deck where his supervisor Giwan was reviewing the construction progress on her tablet computer. The woman had been working without rest for months, driving the project forward with an intensity that worried everyone around her. "These things scare me," Taeyang said quietly, looking out at the massive weapons taking shape around them. "We are building devices that can freeze entire solar systems. What if we cannot control them? What if the cascade effect spreads beyond our targets?" Chuan looked up from her tablet, her face showing the strain of months without proper sleep. "The Kethmori did not worry about control when they turned Earth to ash," she replied. "They did not ask if their heat weapons might spread too far. They simply burned our world and moved on to the next target." Taeyang understood her anger, but the fear remained. The thermal nullification platforms were unlike any weapon humans had ever built. They did not simply destroy their targets. They changed the fundamental nature of space itself, creating regions where the laws of physics seemed to break down. The test results from the laboratory had been impressive, but this was different. This was a weapon that could potentially freeze entire galaxies. The construction took 4 months to complete. When the platforms were finished, they looked like enormous crystalline flowers floating in space, their petals made of metal and quantum generators. Each platform was connected to the others by streams of energy that created a network spanning the entire asteroid belt. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. Admiral Jiho arrived for the final inspection aboard his flagship, accompanied by a fleet of observation vessels. The admiral had aged visibly during the months of construction. The weight of command and the memory of Earth's destruction carving lines in his face, but his determination had never wavered. "Are we ready for the first test?" he asked as he toured the command center that had been built on the largest platform. "Yes, sir," replied Dr. Wanho, who had been overseeing the technical aspects of the project. "We have identified a target system for the initial test. A Kethmori outpost with 3 planets orbiting a red dwarf star. Intelligence reports indicate it is defended by a small fleet, but no major population centers. The test target was located 12 light-years away, a system that the Kethmori had claimed as their own centuries ago. 3 barren planets circled the small red star, their surfaces covered with the same crystalline monuments that marked all Kethmori territory. A handful of their spear-shaped ships patrolled the system, unaware that humanity was about to unleash something unprecedented. The human fleet approached the target system carefully, deploying the thermal nullification platform. At the edge of the solar system, the device was much smaller than the weapons they had built in the asteroid belt, but it contained the same quantum cascade generators that would spread the freezing effect throughout the system. Operator Minji sat at the control station aboard the observation ship, her hands steady on the activation controls despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. She had lost her entire family when the Kethmori attacked the Proxima Centauri colony, and the memory of that loss gave her the strength to complete her mission. "Platform is in position," she reported. "All systems are online and ready for activation." Admiral Jiho stood behind her, watching the tactical display that showed the positions of the Kethmori ships and planets. "Activate the weapon," he ordered. The effect began immediately. A sphere of absolute darkness appeared around the thermal nullification platform, expanding outward at a significant fraction of the speed of light. As it grew, everything it touched simply stopped. The vacuum of space itself seemed to freeze, creating a region where even light could not move. The Kethmori ships tried to flee, but they were too slow. As the expanding sphere reached them, their crystalline hulls began to crack and shatter from the extreme cold. Their heat-based weapons failed completely, unable to function in the absolute zero environment. Within minutes, the entire fleet had been reduced to frozen debris drifting in space. But the cascade effect did not stop there. The sphere continued to expand, reaching the 3 planets and freezing them solid in seconds. The red dwarf star at the center of the system began to flicker as the extreme cold reached its outer layers. The nuclear fusion reactions that had burned for billions of years started to slow down and then stopped completely. "My God," Minji whispered, staring at the readings on her screen. "We did not just freeze the system, we killed the star itself." The red dwarf collapsed in on itself as its core crystallized, becoming a ball of frozen matter that would never burn again. The cascade effect had turned an entire solar system into a tomb of ice and darkness. Admiral Jeho watched the expanding sphere of frozen space through the view screen, his expression grim but satisfied. "Good," he said quietly. "Now they will know what it feels like to watch their worlds die." Okay. Admiral Jeho stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the holographic display that showed the Kethmori homeworld cluster. 7 star systems spread before him like jewels on black velvet, connected by enormous space structures that had taken the ancient aliens millions of years to build. 50 billion Kethmori lived in this region of space, their civilizations spanning multiple worlds and artificial habitats that stretched between the stars. This was the heart of their empire, the place where they had planned the destruction of countless species across the galaxy. From these worlds, they had sent the orders to burn Earth to ash. From these command centers, they had coordinated the genocide of 43 different civilizations. And now, humanity had come to end it all. The thermal nullification platforms hung in space around the cluster like silent predators, each one the size of a small moon and packed with quantum cascade generators. It had taken months to move them into position without being detected, using asteroid fields and nebula clouds to hide their approach. The Kethmori suspected nothing, believing that humanity was still scattered and broken after the destruction of Earth. Captain Sunho commanded the platform deployment team from his position aboard the technical control ship. His hands moved steadily across the activation controls, checking and rechecking the quantum field alignments. The magnitude of what they were about to unleash weighed heavily on everyone involved, but there was no turning back now. Platform 1 is in position and ready, he reported over the communications system. Platform 2 is online. Platform 3 showing green across all systems. One by one, the platforms reported their readiness. Each device was positioned at a critical point around the cluster's perimeter, designed to create overlapping fields of absolute zero that would consume the entire region. The quantum cascade generators hummed with contained energy, ready to unleash forces that could freeze entire galaxies. Admiral Jeho closed his eyes and thought about Earth. He remembered the blue oceans and green continents, the cities full of life and laughter, the 8 billion people who had called it home. He thought about his sister, who had worked as a teacher in the floating cities above the Pacific. He thought about his parents, who had grown old together on their small farm. He thought about all the dreams and hopes that had been turned to ash by the Kethmori. "All platforms report ready for activation," Captain Sunho announced. Jeho opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display one last time. The Kethmori ships moved through their home systems without any knowledge of the doom that surrounded them. Their heat-based technology had made them masters of the galaxy for millions of years. But they had never faced an enemy that could turn their greatest strength into weakness. "For Earth," Jeho said quietly, his words carrying across the communication channels to every human ship in the fleet. "Activate all platforms." The effect began immediately and was beyond anything they had imagined. 7 spheres of absolute darkness appeared simultaneously around the cluster, each one expanding outward at tremendous speed. As they grew larger, they began to overlap and merge, creating a vast region of frozen space that consumed everything in its path. The Kethmori ships tried desperately to escape, their crystalline hulls glowing as they pushed their engines to maximum power. But their heat-based propulsion systems began to fail as the absolute cold reached them. One by one, the alien vessels went dark and drifted helplessly in space, their crews frozen solid in seconds. The effect spread to the planets. Next, worlds that had been home to billions of Kethmori became perfect spheres of ice, their atmospheres crystallizing and falling to the surface like snow. The massive space habitats that connected the star systems cracked and shattered as the extreme cold made their materials brittle as glass. But the most spectacular sight was what happened to the stars themselves. The 7 suns that had burned for billions of years began to flicker and dim as the quantum cascade effect reached their cores. Nuclear fusion reactions that had continued since the birth of the galaxy suddenly stopped the stellar material, crystallizing into solid matter. The stars collapsed in on themselves, becoming frozen spheres that would never burn again. Within 6 hours, an entire galactic sector had been transformed into a crystalline tomb. The light from the dead stars hung motionless in space, frozen in its journey across the void. Planets, ships, space stations, and even the vacuum itself had been locked in eternal stillness. Communications Officer Yuna suddenly looked up from her station, her face pale with shock. "Admiral, we are receiving transmission signals from Kethmori. Vessels outside the frozen zone. They are trying to surrender." Jiho moved to her station and listened to the translated messages. The surviving Kethmori were offering to restore Earth, to bring back the dead, to do anything if humanity would only stop the cascade effect from spreading further. The Admiral stared at the expanding field of frozen space, feeling the weight of what humanity had become. They had not just survived the attempt to destroy them, they'd created a weapon that could kill entire galaxies. They had become something that could freeze the universe itself. "Tell them that Earth is gone?" "And so are they," he replied after a long moment. "But send orders to all our ships. Destroy the remaining platforms. This weapon dies with us." The human fleet turned their guns on their own thermal nullification devices, reducing them to scrap metal floating in space. The technology that could freeze galaxies would not be allowed to exist any longer than necessary. As the last platform was destroyed, Jiho watched the frozen sector of space where the Kethmori homeworld cluster had been. Somewhere in that crystalline silence lay 50 billion beings who had thought themselves masters of the galaxy. They had learned too late that there were some prices too high to pay for conquest. The stars would remember this day forever. Day that humanity had frozen a galaxy in the name of 8 billion graves.